into the collective intelligence of the UN, ... and beyond, because we know from the way the new development agenda was developed that this is way beyond the UN system. It's way beyond even the governments that signed up for this agreement. So we really need to tap a bit broader than that. Our speaker today is Geoff Mulgan, who is the CEO of NESTA. NESTA is a leading innovation charity in the UK, but also works with many countries worldwide, which are trying to open up, apply design thinking, change the way they apply tech in some cases, but also really expand the net of participation in the way they design and deliver their services for the people they serve. Within the UN, many of us, I think, work with NESTA, UNDP, UN Women, maybe even UNICEF. And others probably that I don't know of, but we know that we're very reliant on helping us open up to new ideas, foresighting, design thinking, behavioral economics, gamification, all of those buzzwords that we think might help us solve some of our complex problems, but we're not really sure what they are yet. So let me just then just to say that we're really, from the UN Development Group, we're interested in this conversation because we know that we need to work in a more integrated way to help governments deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're curious to see whether collective intelligence is a framework for that silo-breaking kind of work that brings together, the thinking of economists and meteorologists and gender equity experts and has them actually make sense. So just to hand over to you, Geoff, to lead us through the presentation, and then we'll open up for questions and answers. Just to also say, do we have some people online, Janine?
We do have a couple of people online, but we just recently advertised.
Okay, so
link, and this is also being recorded for all those people who showed interest and are in different time zones.
Good to know.
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for the invitation to be here, and thanks for all the brain power and collective intelligence in this room. So when I'm keen that this is much a conversation as a monologue, because I've certainly got as many questions as answers. But what I'll do is hopefully go reasonably fast through some sort of live approaches, methods, but also sort of issues and potential challenges for the UN system. And let's see where that takes us, and hopefully to something useful. Collective intelligence is a bit of a buzzword at the moment, and like all buzzwords, it has some real utility and a fair amount of sort of hype and hot air, and it's quite important to distinguish the two. I've just spent my last 2 days, one thing I won't talk about, but relates to your intro. I've got a sort of academic position at the moment at Harvard working on problem solving. And so we're trying to actually sort of look at the history of theory and practice of problem solving in the public sector. And maybe something we might talk about later is so where that gets to and where your thinking is on that. And yeah, I'm slightly immersed in trying to make sense of that. And we're doing training at both national and city level on problem solving sort of methods, which I guess is what this is part of. So yeah, the organization where I come from, should I stand up maybe, is NESTA. That's our acronym. It was originally the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, but we probably do as much on the sort of social side and working with governments. We have quite a lot of work on research, designing new statistics, analyzing phenomena, social phenomena, etc. We run, we call innovation labs, which sort of do real life experiments in health systems or school systems or with cities and civil society. We are an investor, so I spend some of my life more like a kind of venture capital investor, impact investment, etc. And the part of us which has probably had most interface with certainly UNDP is about innovation skills, where we've tried to sort of distill methods of generating ideas, using evidence, design methods, data methods, behavioral economics, etc., into usable form, ideally with as little mystification as possible. And part of our goal there is to put lots of consultancies out of business by making things which they charge lots of money for and make sound very complicated, try and show it's actually quite simple, which is usually the case. And some of that work, there's two little examples which may overlap with you. One is we started coordinating a sort of network of public labs and innovation teams around the world. I think I'm not sure any of you were here, we did a gathering in July of about 400 people working in these teams from New York to Sao Paulo to Mumbai, etc. There's lots of them, and we try and sort of help them think about the method. They're usually working for a minister or a prime minister or a mayor, and we do a sort of monthly newsletter of interesting stuff they're up to. That was yesterday's one called Lab Notes. So if you're interested in a very digestible, just 10 or 12 things you can very quickly get a sense of, please sign up for that. And DIY is one of our frameworks for making innovation skills easily accessible. In its first year, we got about 400,000 users in 200 countries, and we're now sort of turning that into a MOOC form, and UNDP's helped a lot with that in some countries like China, where it was translated into Mandarin, it's in Spanish and Arabic and so on. So there's a body of stuff there which we might come back to, and we're really keen to continue collaborating with you on making these tools really accessible to anyone from an NGO to someone in a bit of the public sector. In the last year, we've been trying to sort of build on that and apply it to collective intelligence. And about a year ago, I wrote a really boring academic paper on what this might mean, a sort of theory of collective intelligence, which I won't bore you with. And we've got a sort of team now working on collective intelligence tools in fields like healthcare, etc. If you're interested, again, there's a whole sort of academic literature. There's a thing on our website of the sort of academic conference we held on it a couple of months ago. It is a field of sort of rapidly emerging sort of theory and practice on everything from how does Wikipedia really work to the science of meetings, etc. But again, I'll try and sort of focus on the practical rather than the theoretical side of this. The sort of problematic which I guess prompts this is the sense that we have all of these kind of technologies coming on stream, from sort of Fitbits and sensors to supercomputers like Watson to Google DeepMind, which is based in London. Lots of new technologies for intelligence, but actually not that much sign of them being useful or used on the things which matter most. And indeed, there's a paradox that often the institutions which make the most use of these make the stupidest mistakes. As we saw in the last decade in finance, but it's almost a more general sort of weird phenomenon, which we've been trying to make sense of. And with COP21 underway, so one of the intriguing questions, I guess, to all of you is, if you were starting from scratch trying to create a truly intelligent global system on climate change, what would it look like? How would you reinvent IPCC? How would you reinvent COP-type meetings? And so on. And I'd love to hear your views on that. But anyway, we've got this paradox. On the one hand, unprecedented volume and quality of tools for analysis and pattern recognition and prediction, but often when it comes to the things which matter most, they're not being used, they're not being very useful. And that's kind of the frustration, I guess, which drives what we're working on. How can we link these amazing tools better into really value for the public? And there are lots of sort of small-scale things which are quite novel, and collective intelligence things. So some of you will know this sort of thing where people identify mosquitoes. Again, it uses anyone around the world can use this site to identify different mosquito types. So that's very much using the knowledge of the crowd. There are lots of online tools offering small problem-solving capacities, Amazon Turk or this sort of one. And this one in maths is where they post really complex maths problems and then try and get a community of mathematicians to solve them. Again, it is collective intelligence applied to everything from sort of environmental health identification, practical problem solving, or very theoretical problem solving. And there are lots of examples, but none of them quite mature. They're all still interesting rather than, I think, high impact so far. The one slide of theory I'll share is this one, which we found quite useful and it's very basic, but say it's the only bit of theory I'll share, where we've tried to sort of break down what the elements are of any intelligence, whether it's an individual or an organization or a city or a team. We would say that you can sort of break down what it has. It has some ability to sort of see the world, to see what's happening, to draw on data of all kinds, which could be, you know, longevity or income levels or just annoyance. You know, there's all sorts of things which are observation. You then have to fit that into some model of the world, so operating models, and indeed to a degree the models come before the data. There's always some sort of theory of how the world works the data fits into. There's then the ability to focus on the stuff that matters. There's the ability to analyze, to spot patterns, to reason, etc. There's creativity, the ability to imagine new things, drawing on these. There's the ability to remember and not make mistakes. And then there's judgment and wisdom. And one of the things you can use this for is actually analyzing something like a city government. How well is it doing each of these things? Some institutions are really good at observation but terrible at wisdom. Some are almost too creative but terrible at memory, so they end up reinventing the wheel. So we've used this as a sort of diagnostic framework. And it's also a way of thinking about what technology is doing. So we've got lots of technologies for analysis, so like New York's fire prediction algorithms, which many of you will know, which is one of the many new predictive algorithms helping places direct their energies to targeting the buildings which are at most risk of burning down rather than ones which are actually burning down, or which individuals are most at risk of going to hospital or reoffending. We got lots of tools for observation, like all the citizen ones like Peta Jakarta on flooding in Jakarta, and quite a lot of new tools for creativity. That's Kaggle, which is the, again, sort of data platform where anyone around the world can contribute to solving data problems and gets paid for it. So on each of these, there's a kind of technology story going on, including memory. Almost none, though, on judgment and wisdom, and that's, I think, one of the leading to some imbalances. But anyway, that's a little bit of theory I'll share. So what I'm going to do is sort of 2 minutes or so each on 6 possible areas where the collective intelligence agenda could be useful for your work, but also where you could challenge the people like me and my colleagues to be more useful. So I'm going to go so rapidly through a few of these, and hopefully some of them may at least spark a conversation. Some of them may sound very naive to you or off beam, but hey, that's what makes the conversation interesting. So I'll be quite brief. So the first is country strategies. How would you apply collective intelligence methods to country strategy? Now, in a way, this is sort of part of my personal background. I used to run the strategy team in the UK government. I helped set one up in Australia. I worked in China and Singapore and elsewhere on sort of national strategy, and indeed wrote a book on it. What's to me interesting is the places which are beginning to turn that from a thing done by a group of experts in the heart of a national government to much more open processes of tapping into wider expertise. And I still think the best example in the world is a very small one, South Australia, which has been going now for 10, 12 years with a strategic plan, which on the one hand has very wide involvement in setting goals. There's community input, media input, stakeholder discussion. It has a very structured independent assessment of whether progress is being made. They have a whole series of targets and a assessment process, which is kind of quite honest when things aren't working, and in a way continuous deliberation around the milestones on the way to improving the business environment or jobs or health. There's some, this has some similarities with places like Oregon. Finland has done this. I don't know how relevant this is to the countries you're working on. In some ways, this appears to require a very kind of developed world, rich world capability in government, in civil society, in the media, but there may be elements there which could be done in lots of other places. This is just an example from the South Australia one on Aboriginal well-being, just to give you a flavour of the sort of thing they're doing. They'll set a target on school attendance rate, and very much like what you do, this is the commentary on what's working, what's being achieved, what isn't, and sometimes a commentary then on whether the target was right or not. At the very least, I think there's an interesting debate to be had about what are the most usable, lean, light methods for making a country strategy process much more collective, much more open, much more transparent, and if nothing else, tapping into the experts. So on this particular one, most of the expertise on this does not sit within the government. It will sit within Aboriginal communities, amongst teachers and so on, and structured methods of tapping into the people who really know about things are, I still think, very underused. And I'll say one bit more about that in a moment. So question number one to all of you: does collective intelligence method have anything to do with next generation country strategies? And yeah, there's the one other thing I would mention on that. This is the kind of strategy framework which I used to use. The one thing which I don't think the UN has done, but my most satisfying experience of strategy in countries is the thing we call strategic audits, where we try to get a whole leadership team of ministers and officials to stand back and assess what was or wasn't working, using tools like anonymized interviews with all of them, where we'd interview every minister about what's really happening and then present back to the leadership group a picture of the reality, which turned out to be very different from what they would say in public or indeed in front of each other. There's a whole set of methods of how do you get a whole leadership team to think together as a team, which are almost unused in, I would say, 98% of the world's governments. And yet they're quite powerful tools. Next sort of bundle of stuff is citizen engagement. How do you help lots of people take part in these things? There are decades of experiment on this. At NESTA, we've, in the last year, been running an experiment using a set of tools we call Dissent, which have attempted to draw on the current generation of online deliberation tools and take them a step further. And we've experimented mainly in Spain, working with cities and political parties, in Iceland and in Finland. And what they're essentially now doing is allowing you to open up decision-making processes in quite subtle ways. So in the Helsinki case, you have an open API for every bit of decision-making, so that civil society can create apps which allow people to track decisions and input to them, to make proposals, to comment on policy, comment on implementation in sort of real time. And these are all trying to get beyond just sort of yes-no referendums to quite structured, string-based discussions, deliberations, and so on. They're definitely, again, not mature. It's a field of lots of experimentation underway from Seoul in Korea to Argentina. But I'd be intrigued what your view is of the use of these, again, in getting more collective intelligence into decision-making. And in some cases, they're about citizens participating on things which matter to them as citizens. But again, many of these are useful for drawing in expertise to help decision-making. So it's citizens as contributors to knowledge, as well as citizens as recipients. And in the last year, we've been doing quite a lot on the smart cities agenda, mainly in India and China, where, as you'll know, there are hundreds of smart city programs. And UNDP, in fact, helped sponsor this one from China a few months ago. And in particular, we were trying to get the Chinese cities to think of smart cities not just as hardware and sensors and so on, but actually how do you involve your citizens in decision making? How do you tap the intelligence of people? And there are lots of good examples from around the world in that pamphlet, if you're interested, about really smart cities as involving smart citizens, not just hardware. And I think there's a really important agenda there. And though I'd still say most cities around the world are doing kind of the old-fashioned smart city stuff, which is just plonk lots of hardware in the ground. And on that, again, there's a lot happening in terms of sort of consultation and engagement. France, I think, is actually doing some very good stuff. This was their digital strategy, which they opened up for engagement in a very sophisticated sort of mobile phone-based way. And in my country, Scotland does it very well with, again, methods of engagement which are much more nuanced and deliberative than the traditional consultation methods. And one of the things being looked at is how to use machine learning and semantic analysis tools so you can actually take hundreds of thousands of inputs and distill the main messages, the sentiments of a very large population. And in the past, the problem with all of these things was how do you cope with huge numbers of inputs? Who's actually going to read them? And now that technology is just beginning to be usable to digest those into reasonable formats. Next, very quickly, so crowdsourcing solutions. In some ways, this is quite familiar territory. How do you open up problems to wider solutions? This is our favorite example from 300 years ago. Don't many of you recognize this guy? You probably don't. So 300 years ago, the British Parliament was having real trouble with ships crashing into continents, and it couldn't work out a way to help ships discover their longitude, where they were in the sea. So they offered a then £20,000 prize for anyone who could come up with a reliable way of fixing the longitude of a ship at sea. And in the end, it was won by a humble clockmaker from Yorkshire, not by the grand professors and astronomers. And he simply had a better solution. It took decades for them to acknowledge it. But it's one of the early examples of a sort of crowdsourcing open innovation method, and was very successful and helped pave the way for globalization. There's now lots of sort of crowdsourcing methods out there, and organizations from Innocentive and OpenIDO and Marbla and so on, offering different ways of tapping into, say, communities of problem solvers. Last year, we created the Longitude Prize for its 300th anniversary. It was 2014, but this time did a little tweak, which was we got the British public to vote between these different so global challenges as to which they thought should be the longitude for 2014. And we worked with the BBC, who did some TV programs and web material, and schools, and Amazon actually also backed it and emailed all their customers to get them involved. So we had a big sort of public debate on these global challenges, and in the end, it's now antibiotic resistance was the chosen one. But the more general point there was, on the one hand, I think this worked quite well in opening up the question of what the big challenges were to a much larger conversation. And then the actual prize to solve the problem is now open to anyone, anywhere in the world. And we've been doing road shows in India and China and Latin America and the US to get teams competing. And there are lots of teams from around the world now competing to win it. I'm not sure how much, the UNDP's used this sort of method a bit. And we worked a bit on one around energy. One which we've been trialing in the last year is a thing called Open Data Challenge Series, which applies this same method to getting value out of data. And here we would get a bit of public data, which could be data on energy use or education performance amongst teenagers, and then open it up to anyone to try and combine that data with other data sets to create something useful and valuable. And we've now run a stream of these, and we think created much more useful outputs than classic hackathons or just data scientists plopped into a city. And PwC just did an evaluation of this program and said it was getting a 10-to-1 return. I don't believe that, but it's kind of quite useful for us to make that sort of claim. No, it definitely is getting a value which other things aren't doing, and we're hoping to take that, I think, to Indonesia next, and India. But again, it's a way of essentially open innovation. Anyone can play, but that UNDP can be or whoever funds it can sort of determine what the challenge should be, what the task, etc. And prompted by a thing which Estonia did on Friday, I don't know if any of you been following what Estonia's been doing, because it's been going slightly crazy. They first of all let anyone in the world become an Estonian e-citizen last year. So you can become a citizen and you can set up businesses in Estonia. And they just on Friday announced this thing where there's a global public notary system using blockchain technology. So you can notify births, deaths, marriages, and so on in Estonia. I'm not quite sure how useful that is, but the thought is, blockchain technology has extraordinary potential to dramatically lower costs of law, lower costs of remittances, and this is the sort of thing where I think nearly all the creative ideas will come from unexpected places. And so my question for you is, could you be running global prizes, for example, in use of blockchain technology to dramatically cheapen access to useful law for citizens around the world? We're working a bit on that with the European Commission in Europe on blockchain uses, but this is, I'd say, Estonia kind of jumping the gun a bit there. Next category, orchestrating global knowledge commons. So there's a kind of newish phenomenon of global knowledge commons, which are usually kind of web-based platforms producing, distributing, organizing knowledge. Things like Wikipedia would count as one of these. They're often trying to synthesize knowledge as well as just collate lots of it. They're trying to have hierarchies of quality and reliability, so you can actually, through these, see what's useful or not. And there's a whole mix of things going on between peer-to-peer, traditional science, etc. And there's a lot of this in citizen science, patients, etc. So, two live examples. OpenStreetMap. Probably many of you are quite familiar with that, which is a classic global knowledge commons. It has, fairly clear sort of rules of what counts as quality. It achieves mapping very, very cheaply and universally. Do any of you know the Conversation? It seems to be much less known here, but I think this is almost the most interesting global commons, which began in Australia about 3 years ago, funded by all the universities as an output for academics to write about news or science, but with a team of editors making it digestible to a general audience. This is now launched here in the US, where I think about 40 universities are funding it, and Google, Facebook, in India, South Africa, in the Netherlands, France, and it's sort of almost by accident become a kind of global news system. And because it's only academics can write for it, at least in theory, what you read there is reliable. Not always, depending on what your view of academics is. Interestingly, having then created this network of academics commentators, governments are now realizing they can use this for open policy making. And this is just starting in Australia, where the government asks the Conversation to find the 200 academics who know about tax design and involve them in a structured consultation. So this is becoming a really interesting global commons, part of whose value is not quite what they originally intended, which was to be a sort of outward-looking medium. But at the very least, have a look at it. I think it's going to become very important in the years ahead, and unusual, let's say, in having a sort of quality built in. We certainly fund the bit of it called Hard Evidence, which looks at the role of evidence in policy making. And that's part of another sort of way of thinking about global commons. At NESTA, we set up this thing called the Alliance for Useful Evidence, which was originally just in the UK, trying to bring together all the people generating evidence on public policy, but also the users in health or policing or education. and it's an open access network, government, universities, charities, businesses. We persuaded the government then to create a series of what works centres, which try and synthesize knowledge about things. So this is an example from the one on crime, you probably can't quite see, but the What Works Centre on Crime Reduction just synthesizes the knowledge on different interventions, how much impact they have, the strength of evidence, their cost, etc., to be really usable by police officers, policymakers, etc. The one on education is now used regularly by about 3/4 of school principals. And the whole emphasis has been on usefulness. We had wasted loads of money in the past on repositories of evidence which weren't used. We'd wasted huge amounts of money in evaluations no one read. And all of these are now focused on the demand side, the use side. We're doing the same on health knowledge commons, which is a sort of something a much more complicated story of how do you get the world's knowledge about health easily accessible by a nurse or a doctor or a patient. Anyway, it's a field which I think is full of promise. I'll jump over this. But I'm not sure what the UN's view of this is. It's difficult, but interesting. So just 2 more chunks, then I'll shut up. So one is better meetings. I go to a lot of meetings. You probably go to a lot of meetings. And about 6 months ago, somebody complained that all our meetings at NESTA were the same, and we'd become kind of formulaic, and we had speakers and panels and so on. So I did a bit of work with an intern looking at what was the state of science of meetings. How should you organize an academic conference or a parliament or a boardroom? And about 3 weeks ago, I put out a paper which tried to pull this together. And there is actually quite a lot of science out there. I would say that 99% of the meetings I go to are clearly at odds with even the basic sort of science of meetings, which is amazing in a way. And so in this, the paper looked at not just the traditional meetings, boardrooms, conferences, workplace meetings, but also the sort of innovations in meetings, like flipped conferences and unconferences and open space, etc. I ended up almost as skeptical of the innovations as of the traditional ones. And they all seem to quickly sort of almost fetishize the particular solution and not really thought through what works. And as far as I could find, there is no center of research on meetings globally. No place which is really reliably has is on top of the science of this. So unwisely in this paper, which I would urge you to read and critique, quite a few people have made very good criticisms of it so far, we sort of tried to distill a few sort of lessons of meetings, which I'll go through very, very quickly. One was that usually meetings should have very clear ends, what they're trying to achieve, how they're trying to achieve it in preparation, kind of obvious. Very active facilitation roles, often by quite junior members of staff, really, really important. Multi-platform, really important. Lots of meetings need formats to contain the extroverts, the opinionated or powerful. So the US Supreme Court is always the most junior judge speaks first, not the most senior one. Devices where everyone gets to speak. Lots of methods for doing that. Physical environments which help you attend. Clear-cut divisions of labor before and after meetings. We suggested a sort of formula for meeting maths, which is how much time you have, how many people, shared knowledge and breadth of issue. And most of the meetings sort of try to do far too much in too little time or too many people. And there's a sort of maths and so on. And finally, some of the best meetings don't happen. And we try to sort of say when you just shouldn't have a meeting at all. But anyway, this was an attempt, and we're now trying to apply this ourselves. But I'd be fascinated what the UN view of its own meetings would be. And could you increase the productivity of meetings by applying some method, some experiment? Because there's so much human energy goes into bad meetings. And hopefully not this one, but I have to say all that I'm doing is basically at odds with much of what I'm saying here. And then very finally, I wanted to sort of put a thought to you about something which the UN could do and promote, which I think might have a lot of impact. Over the last few years, I've been doing a bit of work looking at universities around the world which use challenge-based learning, where essentially the learning model for students isn't just sitting in a classroom and learning physics or computer science or history, but where groups of students work on real-life problems in teams in a multidisciplinary way. And there are lots of examples, some focused on, medicine or engineering, where it's actually quite usual to work on real-life problem solving. Finland's Aalto University is entirely problem-based. There's elements in again, Estonia, Sydney, and Stanford has bits of it. I've just been in Harvard, where they've been doing a field lab where students work on real-life problem solving, and so on. And last year, I worked very closely with the president of Tsinghua University in Beijing, Chen Jining, on creating what we called Open Fiesta, open faculties for innovation, education, science, technology, and art. And there the idea is to get groups of undergraduates and graduate students working on the real problems of Beijing and also on unsolved science problems. Unfortunately, Chen Jining then became environment minister in China, so this is happening in Shenzhen and Beijing, but not quite in the way we intended. But the basic notion was, you've got this amazing brain power in places like Tsinghua. They have 1,000 applicants for every place. But how do you get that brain power working on the things which matter on the street, on poverty or loneliness or air quality? And so since then, a group of universities doing this sort of thing have been wondering, could this all be taken to another stage? Could there be a kind of global university network focused on real life challenges, where you might get 100 universities encouraging these sort of challenge-based teams? Could you link it into the SDGs? So all of the projects are formally tied into an SDG. Ideally local issues. So what we're trying to get away from is sort of Princeton sending students to Maharashtra, but rather working on the local problems. Integrate it all into coursework and assessment, because this only becomes real if it is part of the life of a university. But ideally connected by some kind of shared platform, so a student working on a gender issue or a water issue can quickly get up to speed with the best available information, see other projects being done around the world. But the aim being, the world has 150 million students now, huge wealth in universities, but only a fraction of that really going to help the world solve its big problems like SDGs. And I don't know quite how this would work. We sketched out some of the model, but a bit of a push from the UN. I think there's a whole resource of collective intelligence not being tapped, and some relatively light touch measures would transform it. And I think a hell of a lot of those 150 million students want to be part of global problem solving and aren't at the moment because there isn't quite the right vehicles. So that's just sort of a few of the things where I think collective intelligence could be practical in the UN's work. I apologize that all of these are, in some ways, emergent ideas. They're not all fully formed. I don't know where they fit or not, but at least I hope this might prompt a conversation.
Thank you so much, Geoff. That was fantastic. I think you've given us a lot to think about. And I think of your 6 areas, probably the ones at the beginning we in the UN have some experience with, but as it gets into beyond consultation and using citizens as experts, we would probably have a bit less experience on the ground. I would just say that we have a lot to build on. You may be aware of in the run-up to the agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals, the Millennium Campaign and the UN Development Group reached out more than it ever has, so that about 1 out of every 1,000 people on the planet gave input to what they thought their top 8 priorities are for making their future better. And this was linked to an intergovernmental process. We did have some indication that it impacted that process, particularly when it came to determining whether to include good governance and access to justice and the strength of public institutions as a goal itself. The fact that an overwhelming number of people said, yes, this is important for my future, did help with that. So we do have some to build on. But let me hand over to Jens, our moderator this year, to moderate the discussion in the hopes of equal distribution of talking time.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Nice seeing you again.
Yep.
Good to hear. No, I think that you laid it out, and I think your summary slide is very good. So I thought, with no further ado, why don't we try just to open up the conversation and see what you think. Some of these ideas getting traction, and let's start with the top. That means that around the country strategies. I think, Kenny, can you help me here? But it's something like 33, 34 new UNDOCs will be prepared in 2016. Is that right?
Yeah.
The question is, could we see some of those ideas walk into to strengthen the process sitting behind, and therefore to strengthen the quality of the UNDOCs?
Sorry, before you read, we had a no acronym rule, so.
Yeah, no, I was very intimidated by that meeting slide. You know?
But the UNDOCs are the national strategies.
Yes.
The UN country level strategies. But let us just, why don't we just open the floor here? Is there's some ideas that we could use, some ideas we are using already? Please go ahead.
Thanks, Geoff. On the country strategy stuff, I'm thinking also about your Southern Australia strategic plan. We can see how collective intelligence can help come up with a set of goals. Have you got any thoughts of how it can help in trade-offs, in which goals to attain first and what not to do? And related to that, one of the things we struggle with sometimes in the world of human development reporting in countries is around ownership. And that we think it's a good thing, and we try to achieve it, but we don't really know whether we have. Have you got any thoughts about how you actually measure and understand whether something is owned by the community it purports to represent?
I think let me just take one more. Can you just?
I think somewhere there you said that one of the things, certainly with technology platforms like Consultations, NESTA supports the hard data and evidence piece. Now, for us, it's interesting that some of the UN conversations that have been more in the public domain, it's interesting that probably the issue is whether they're asking more about vision things, like how do you see the role of the UN in your country? And where do you see where do you think the footprint should be, etc., as opposed to can we hear from you what the facts are on something, so the pickup of the data and the evidence, and we find different teams using the more open public conversation, citizen spaces in very different ways. And where are you seeing optimal pickup or use in this?
Well, I think that the 2 points linked. So in my view, you have to have a link between the leadership who are going to be accountable for the decisions and the open processes. There's been a lot of experiment with very open processes, but they're completely detached from the leaders, and therefore they don't survive or they're ignored. And it almost sort of pretends they're decision making rather than advisory. So the kind of methods we're working on are usually hybrids, where you still have elected leaders and a parliament, but you've got a much more open process of deliberation around it or feeding into it, but you're still honest, as it were, about where the buck stops. And so in my view, a lot of the participatory democracy stuff went slightly wrong by often being a bit unclear about authority, essentially. I think that relates to trade-offs too. There have been various online tools for citizens to work through trade-offs on spending and tax for decades, actually. But it's very hard to get these with very high usage levels. They tend to be very much for a small group. And ultimately, that trade-off work probably has to be done within a pretty small leadership group, because it just takes a lot of time to work it through. So I think we're still some way shy of being able to do the trade-off work on the big platforms, even though Porto Alegre type participatory budgeting, and Philippines has now got a participatory budgeting exercise underway, which I don't really know about, but which may be a counterexample to what I just said. But I think ideally, as with the ones we've done, you almost start off with the political leadership saying, we want to involve you in helping us think about vision, priorities, etc. And we will draw on your inputs and your ideas, and then we will tell you how we're using them, but we'll acknowledge that they're advisory rather than mandatory, as it were. But I don't know, what's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly on Gina talked about the pre-summit consultations, and what we found in the first round was when it was just, go out there, whoever is interested in the public domain, have a conversation. It was a very different thing to saying, we need to get local government, for example, and service providers and local businesses involved as well. Because if the conversation was a lot about, we're looking to better quality of education and jobs for young people, all we could say, well, we hear you. And that wasn't enough. So we opened these platforms and these dialogue spaces, but the comeback was, it's not enough that you just heard us. We want more, and you are not probably the right person to be telling us, well, what are the new plans you have out there to create better jobs or improve quality education. So by getting in, as you said, the authority, I mean, I don't know if that's the word, but those who are responsible also for responding to the ideas and the issues, it seemed, for me, it was a bit of a surprise that it was, I thought that could be sequenced, and it couldn't. Particularly with young people, the impatience was like, don't tell me you've opened up a conversation just because you want to hear us.
Yeah. I mean, I think on something like youth unemployment, which is, we've had various failed attempts at some multi-city global work on youth unemployment and innovation, which is another story. But there, in a way, two or three of the elements which I found are missing. One is, instead of saying, here's this big problem, is to say, if you had another $10 million or $100 million, where would you spend it to most effect? And so it becomes a crunchy question. Or what could your schools do differently to make sure 16-year-olds were more job ready? Or and then building into that deliberation process sort of inputs like, here are 50 really interesting innovations around the world on youth unemployment. Could any of those be adapted to Cairo or to Lagos? Or this appears to be some of the evidence on what is or isn't working around the world. So again, it's much more deliberative. Otherwise, people, as you say, they get lost or impatient and nothing really happens.
In your presentation, another, please.
Hi, Ian from UNICEF. Just, I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of great crowdsourcing techniques to really try and reach out to people who are affected by government policies and changes, which is really good. I think the interesting challenge for the UN in this is that different people have different capacities to engage with these things. And probably the people whose input we need the most and the most underrepresented in policy are also the people with the least capacity to go on an online system or to send in a text message or however you're collecting this data, or to to be able to engage with the issues you're putting forward. And I just wondered what lessons you have on how to, in a way, you may be creating more of a digital divide by opening up this conversation, and how do you tackle it?
Well, I think last year I wrote a thing about New York, where I said even in New York, there's probably about 1 or 2% of the population who take part in digital consultations, and they are, men in their 20s and 30s with a university degree or even postgraduate. And if you've got any seriousness about inclusive engagement, use radio, use all the other mediums, and don't kid yourself. But for some of these tasks, like expertise mapping, actually digital is very useful and can get you to lots of people quite quickly. So I think it's really important to keep your question in mind, but I still think there's many tasks where that doesn't matter too much. But ones which are about legitimating decisions, then it does matter a great deal who's taking part and the skews of perception you get.
let me just take one more question around that, because I mean, in 1973, I think Robert Chambers wrote a book called "Putting the Last First," and that has shown up in the SDG agenda, that we will leave nobody behind. And the question is a little bit trying to see when we are out there, how do we reach the large citizen? What's your thoughts?
Well, it depends in every context. I was talking just before this meeting to John about work we're doing on dementia. So, you know, people with dementia in a country like mine are probably the most about as disempowered as you could be, or for that matter, teenagers with mental learning difficulties. And strangely, some of the most promising innovation has been working with those groups to give them power. So, I mean, maybe I'll just mention the Dementia project, which we've just started this month, which is basically mobilizing, we hope it'll be hundreds of thousands of people with dementia, using apps and wearables to gather data on their well-being and their physical health, to run real-life experiments on themselves around things like music and diet. And our hope is then also to become also a lobby, to become a collective intelligence. And this is my colleague Stefano has been working on this with, say, patient groups, often a very marginalized nature. How do you use technology and other devices to turn, you know, several 100,000 people with a rare condition or whatever from an entirely passive sort of recipient of the system solutions into an active collective intelligence? And I think a lot can be done. Now that doesn't work for, you know, a tribal community in Myanmar or something like that. But so probably your question has to be made context specific, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, I think the point you're making is that big data is a way that could work
with a bit of care.
No, but I think all of us know that this one actually shows up also in tribal communities.
Yeah,
and
right.
This is the big difference.
Yeah.
Anyway, let me open the floor. Any comments? We're still very much discussing a little bit the planning, but we're spilling into the issue of citizen engagement. Sure, we are in those two areas. Or should we move on and say crowdsourcing?
Is any country strategy a kind of model of collective intelligence, do you think?
Today?
Yeah, or even pointed to it?
Anybody?
Where shall I look
Anybody?
to?
I think we have a few, we've had a few countries this year that have tried new things, and definitely this opening up of the World We Want, the My World survey, all of that sort of showed proof of concept that it is possible for the UN to go at country level and talk to a government, citizens, in a way which is not confrontational and actually adding value. And in fact, in some countries, the governments were really happy because in Moldova in particular, they said this is helping us explain our national development plan, right? So to take it out of the log frame, like you showed from Australia, South Australia, right, and to put it into human terms. So we do have a few examples of countries, you know, Bangladesh, I believe, is trying to work with micro narratives, you know, to get more stories, to use a bit of the machine power that you're talking about to distill this into what is the reality facing vulnerable people and how does it change? We have some countries that are trying to take a really forward-looking, you know, approach. India and Montenegro, sort of with the, you know, participatory foresight work. I think that a lot of this is sitting at the, as you're saying, it's like we're getting input to do the situation analysis, which is our first step in strategic planning. We're not necessarily saying we're getting citizen input into the prioritization, because the way the UN development assistance frameworks work at the ground level, it's a government UN promise of what we're going to be doing with you for 5 years or so. So in the end, there is the decision makers are really those from the line ministries, you know, that we're bringing together in this multi-sectoral process. So that might be one question, but let's
just to jump on that. I think what's key in the work that we do is the final endorsement by the government of the strategy. And obviously the question that it raised, and it's the same in our experience also for strategies that are defined by a single agency. Great for the analytical part of it. Then when it comes to the strategy itself, it's a completely different story. And then the question I would have for that is how does that work in a non-democratic context? you know, I mean, how do you even try to open that conversation with the government partner to go that route for a strategy? So I mean, these are realities I think of our business model here.
Yeah, well, I've probably done half my work on country strategies in non-democracies, but there are ones like China and Singapore. Well, Singapore, half democracy, you know, where in some ways it's much easier to get the leadership buy-in to a strategy and rather calibrated, to say the least, you know, use of citizen input, but with very clear boundaries around it. I mean, that's
I think the technology lure helps a little bit sometimes, right? If it's a gadget-y, you know, kind of innovation, you can slip the participation.
Just picking up on that, actually, the previous comment on the digital divide and the fact that it is, you know, what something like this could do is actually make something look participatory and transparent and make it something so technocratic that instead of bringing it closer, you're actually making it more remote from real participatory process. Because, you know, the reason why I think actually this would be really useful for in China is that it gives the government a tool of saying, look, we are trying to make this open and transparent and participatory, and we are doing some very important steps in that regard. But how do you go from that to saying, great, you're doing this, now extend it to the real public domain where it matters, where people can. It's about for what, by whom, in whose interest. And those questions will not get picked up. You could have a very efficient process, but without it being equitable.
Well, China definitely in its use of Weibo and an input is very, very tightly controlled to give the appearance of feedback. I mean, the South Australian model is hardly digital at all. And I would say its core value was having meetings, face-to-face meetings in communities with politicians sort of being visible and accountable for anger and input and media coverage, intensive media coverage. And those are the things which make it authentic and much harder to use as a manipulative technocratic device.
But let's just try to restate the conversation. You were making an argument where you took the brain and then you listed the various dimensions of what you consider intelligence. And the core of your argument was that could we apply that those definitions of the different dimensions of intelligence to a collective exercise? That was the core of your argument, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So why don't we take that slide that we were looking at, if you don't mind, that brain with the where you also highlighted that there were certain dimensions of the intelligence which were, in a sense, where there was a certain bias, and because I think some of this, the comments that have been made is actually captured there.
Yeah. So maybe just to explain that, and in a way, this is where we're still in a work in progress. Is I think what's easy now, is this. So digital technology means we can have far more observation. You know, you can sense air quality and meteorology and blah, blah, blah. And there's always too much of that. The absorptive capacity of governments is struggling. Memory should be easy, but I think there's a sort of strange failure of organizing memory in usable forms. And that's why these knowledge commons should be much more widespread than they are. But no one quite sees it as their job to perhaps systematically organize the memory. Creativity is much of what probably my organization works on, is practically how do you do this well. And you know, a lot of, I guess, what you're probably working on and interested to hear the collective intelligence things mentioned is probably about, you know, really high-powered analysis. You know, that's sort of the think tank role. Obviously, the most important question is how all of that feeds into your country leaders or whoever else actually just making judgments and being wise in conditions of uncertainty, where there'll still be lots of ambiguity. But you know, where do you see your roles on all of this and the greatest advances? Because the slight risk you see in business is this has moved so fast that often it can lead to slightly stupid mistakes, because it gives you the appearance of knowing everything, but you don't really.
And I think that allows us to make a second point, and that is that the politics, etc., for each of these categories is different. And the one that, let me take out, the one that stands out is creativity. That's very difficult to control. Okay, so Jill, you want to?
Hi.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question regarding the 14 million sterling innovation fund that you guys are running, and I assume you have some lessons learned from that. I'm particularly interested in the innovation fund because I see the UN having less and less resources going forward. And I'm interested in innovation funds because I feel that they can leverage change in the right direction. And what I could figure out from some of the stuff I've read is that you insist on a theory of change, you have mentors on each funding project that you work. So you seem to be approaching innovation in a real active way, almost stealing ideas from the private sector. So I wasn't able to understand everything that's available on your website, but could you speak to this topic?
Yeah, so that's what we run a number of funds, so it's not in this presentation, but maybe I'll just mention two which sort of bring that out. So that the fund you just mentioned is one where the government, British government, gave us money with a particular purpose of finding and scaling innovations which increase public contributions of time and expertise to public services, so hospitals, schools, etc. And because of the fiscal pressures in the UK, you could understand why they wanted that. But I guess the broader point, as in any country, is in fact schools, hospitals, courts even work better if the public are involved as volunteers, not just as clients. And so what we did, a classic way, was a series of sort of open calls. But anything which we funded, as you say, we tried to require them to be much more rigorous on their logic model. We tried to use some of our funding to help them get stronger evidence of efficacy. We have a whole framework on standards of evidence, which I could talk about, which I think is quite powerful. And then we would provide them, with a series of coaches, mentors, supports to help them through that journey. I mean, another one which I hope we're going to announce in a week or two's time is on apps for mental health, digital tools for mental health, where we'll be using the same approach for digital tools for mainly probably depression and other mental conditions, where we'll be, first of all, trying to find what are the most promising solutions, but then help them get better evidence that they work. Almost none of them currently on the market have very good evidence. It's mainly anecdotal, and help them, say, redefine their organizational model to grow and spread. So we have a very hands-on approach to these innovation funds. So they're quite expensive to run, but I hope deliver more value. And there's lots of other funds I could talk about, but that probably gives you a flavor of how we work. I mean, just on that, we're doing a study at the moment of innovation agencies around the world, the more sort of business-oriented ones, where I think we're looking at 20 from Brazil and China and Taiwan to Finland and the US, and that's partly looking at the state of the art on using money to drive innovation in the economy, and that'll be out, I think, in January, if anyone's interested.
I have two questions. One, picking up on Ian's question on the digital divide. I think it's one element how to reach the most marginalized, but then also, assuming we're reaching them, how you design the feedback loops. And it's just a question of examples you've seen of engaging citizens, of designing it where the user gets an encouraging feedback and it keeps the person engaged in both the processes of the examples you mentioned. My other question is, I'm always curious about the demographics of people engaging collective intelligence, of the ones you can reach. You mentioned the people engaging in the New York exercise were white and male, and that's what we know about the majority of Wikipedia users as well. Do you have insights in to what extent does it matter who designs online platforms, the tone of conversations, just in terms of gender equality, for example, the openness for women to engage? Have you seen any examples, any research that will help the UN design more inclusive initiative?
Wikipedia is 90% male. OpenStreetMaps, I think, is even higher as a percentage. We had the figures at our conference on this, and it must matter. I mean, it's Wikipedia has a single cognitive style, and there's been some interesting work recently on if Wikipedia was launching now, actually you'd make it much more plural in its sort of style of writing and comment. At the moment, it's a single style. It's a sort of quite an interesting. And when we've been working on the Health Knowledge Commons, this comes right to the fore. So what formats, because our ideal there is, how do you make the world's knowledge about health accessible through a smartphone if you are a 73-year-old, relatively uneducated patient or a doctor or a nurse? And fairly obviously, you have to have quite a range of different modes of delivering information. For most of them, short videos will be the most useful, not text-based stuff. And for others, it requires very detailed evidence and citations. So we've been working with the BBC mainly on trying to answer this question, and I hope we'll have a prototype next year with one disease group on how a commons can really answer your question, where the underlying knowledge is shared, i.e. what do we really know about how you should handle your diet or your behavior with type 2 diabetes, but there is representations are much more multiple. And crucially, in our version of the Health Knowledge Commons, you as a patient can add in your own experience, both individually and collectively, so that someone like you can find what you said. And so the knowledge isn't just doctor accredited, but is also experiential. And we set out some sort of blueprints of this. I don't feel we've kind of cracked it, but we've been attempting exactly your point to address it. On consultations, one of the most intriguing findings about government consultations worldwide, is that for people to be happy in a consultation, it's really important that they get feedback about what happened. And amazingly often, governments don't communicate to them. They get the input, they go off and make a decision. And even if your input is ignored, you feel much happier if you've been told what happened. So one of the things in the design of all these platforms now is trying to build in much more conscious feedback, explanation, and narrative of what's going on, rather than just sort of sucking in public input. The single best experience in my life of groups participating in consultation policy design, which I'll just spend 30 seconds on, but is not often repeated. When I worked in the British government, we were working on neighbourhood regeneration for sort of poor housing estates. And we recruited a whole bunch of young teenagers living on those housing estates to do studies on what was happening, what the real life was like, and their policy proposals. And then they presented it to the cabinet, the Prime Minister, with the media present. And that had more impact on the policy process than almost anything I've ever seen. They were helped by sort of journalistic editors to turn their stories into accessible form, but not only were they incredibly clear and crisp and sort of powerful, as it were, but they, of course, were massively empowered by that process. And that involved almost no digital technology at all, but it was deliberately licensing a marginalized group. And 12-year-old kids living in poor estates have no voice at all. They're something their older brothers and sisters often do get a voice they're never listened to. So conscious design of inputs, I think, is vital. Otherwise, you get all sorts of skews, not just the digital one.
So we talked a lot about the many ways that we might look at collective intelligence in the work that we do, and even in the meetings that we have. But my question goes back to the way that we are set up as organizations and working with collective intelligence of our own organizations, and sort of walking the talk before we do it in our own work. So it's really, to me, it's great to talk about all of these cool things that we might do in our work, but it might sit with one person or with one team. And then how do you get the whole organization to recognize that this group knows what's going on in this context, and how we can all sort of experience the collective intelligence of our organization, and then leverage the organization to understand the collective intelligence of what we're trying to understand as an organization.
Yeah. So my simple answer, though it's really a challenge to you, is to sort of go through this list. So crudely speaking, what is your sort of theory of change, your model of how you have affected the world, and can anyone find that when they come to work here? Do you have a data store? So a lot of cities now have a data store where the open data is put in a single place, linked to GitHub or something, so it's easy to access and manipulate. Is your analytical material easily accessible through a knowledge management system, searchable, categorized, etc.? If you achieve that, you're better than any other organization on earth. And so on. And your collective memory, is that easily searchable? And here, actually, I remember working a while ago, the US Army actually was about as good as we could find, but they didn't try and capture everything in digital form, but it was often you could quickly find the person who had worked on the similar problem before and just phone them. And that was more effective than was any sophisticated systems. So that's, in a way, this is a potential agenda for that. And not many organizations have done it well, because the formal bits have to be aligned with the culture and the human and relational side of that, as with all knowledge management.
I'm interested in the last two categories of ideas that you listed. I think the first one, I think we pretty much all have experimented, or at least have discussions internally about them. But to my knowledge, at least in my organization, we haven't had a conversation about better meetings even. And this global university network, I think, is very interesting. I think we engage in many capstone projects.
Yeah.
We've discussed the beyond capstone and talked about this, but not in this term. So do you have anything in writing on these two things? I thought you mentioned a paper on better meetings. So that is open for comments. We can find that on NESTA.
Yeah, that is called Meaningful Meetings.
Yeah.
It's quite short, and I would love to have critical comment on it. It's fairly digestible. There's a podcast version from Monocle, but it's not. I'm sure it's not right, but at least I think every organisation should have a meeting about its meetings. Now, could you cut them in half? Could you change the formats at the very least? And I'd love to know where you get to. On the university one, this has been a conversation amongst a group of people. So one of our partners is Paris, Sorbonne, which is creating a really, really good sort of center of interdisciplinary research. University of Sao Paulo, Monterrey in Mexico, Tsinghua in China. There's a few others. And we've kind of got a half-formed idea. But my hunch is it won't become a wholly formed idea unless someone like the UN, and there isn't anyone like the UN, gives it a little bit of encouragement. And it might be even just to do a feasibility study of what would it take to, let's say, get even 1% of the world's students working on capstone projects linked to SDGs. And let's say the goal was 1.5 million students a year working in a structured way. And I would love to work with any of you on sort of trying to think through how would you operationalize that. My guess is you could quite easily get some of the foundations to fund such a thing. But at the moment, my sense is everywhere there's this, I say, latent brain power and enthusiasm which just isn't being channeled efficiently. And most of the universities are still very, they're cut off from their communities.
We have time for a few more questions, but I'd like to raise another dimension. We talked about the UN planning and all that.
Yeah.
But some of us also work in realities where planning become much more short-sighted. And the question is whether you have any insights in the same principle, but much more short-sighted. Syria is obviously one of those, but there are many other crises globally that have the same nature. And what could we do? And do you have any reflections on when you see these things on television? Because a big part of the UN's work is to intervene where planning is not possible.
Yeah.
In a classical sense.
Well, this is the thing I'm doing at Harvard at the moment is in a way very much focused on that. It's trying to look at the sort of, I think maybe it's before you came in the beginning, it's a theory and practice of problem solving, which people have thought about for hundreds of years, and in particular problem solving in time. And so what we've been trying to put together is, in a sense, a slightly synthetic approach to how do you do problem solving, from very micro ones like street homelessness in New York to perhaps refugees crossing Turkey right now. And with each element of it, time is the key resource. So how do we, and there's a sort of the sequence of steps. I mean, there are lots of different methods out there, but they're all essentially similar in sort of logic. First of all, how do you kind of circle around the problem? How do you probe it? How do you understand underlying causes? How do you, gather your data, the psychology, the economics, the facts? And you can, for any problem, spend 6 months on that, or you can spend a day and a half. And you've just got to sort of calibrate to what you've got. Then there are processes usually of widening your sort of menu of options, where creativity methods come in, scans, etc. And again, you can spend years doing that, or you can set a very tight timetable. Then you have to narrow right down very quickly using classic, appraisal methods. And then there's the iteration as you put those into practice and learn as you do. And this is, say, Syria isn't what we've been working on, but in every real life context, you can have a sort of perfect problem solving approach, which, as I say, take you 5 years, but in reality, everyone's in a hurry. So what we've been trying to work on is how do you make this calibrated to real life conditions. And we're going to try and put this out in a simple interactive format early next year, mainly aimed at cities though, and sort of mayors and city teams. But if you've got, but I say half the people I've been working the last 2 days work on development, problem-driven, iterative adaptation of these sort of terrible acronyms. But do you have a kind of state of the art of quick problem solving of your own?
No, I think it's, listen, time is up. I want to go close because I want to close it on time. I just want to summarize a few things for this week, and it is relevant to what we just discussed. What has happened to us is that with the Sustainable Development Goals, the development agenda has been redefined, and now it's universal. So that means when you're saying that you met a lot of people working on development, logically this is because globally we're working on development. No country in the world can claim that they are sustainable, and only a few countries in the world can claim that they have a clear strategy for transitioning to a sustainable development. So therefore, the UN's role is recognized, but also challenged in many ways. And I think having you here today is very relevant for some of this. I think also if we listen to the questions that were asked, etc., this is relevant to us. So we are questioning how. We are trying to get as much out of you to explain to us how could we do it, how do we do this in difficult contexts, how do we make sure we don't reinforce the digital divide. But for a lot of us, we need better ways of thinking things together. The Sustainable Development Goal paradigm itself built on system theory, and where traditional development paradigms were more linear in their way of thinking. So this means it's timely and it's very welcome. I also think that you have shared thoughts with us early enough so we can help shape them ourselves. You were tentative in many of your answers, and you're willing to share where you are in processes. And I think it's up to us now to also take some of those and then shape them in the way we think about it. I think you did mention, and we did have in the conversation, the transparency agenda. This is vital for the UN to open ourselves up. One of the reasons is if we are not transparent, we cannot even collaborate internally. And we know, and that is also commentary to meetings. We thought we could coordinate ourselves out of our problem, but that has resulted through an excessive amount of meetings. you have to have more structural ways of doing this. And you have, just in what you shared with us, you've challenged that agenda. We are very, very active on that agenda. Then I think we're left with a challenge around the university side. I do not think, and I was thinking of United Nations University. I don't think they're in the room, but I for one would be very happy to take this message to them. I do see that they could play a role here because formally speaking, they have some of this, and it is all a whole of the UN approach to try to get onto the sustainable development agenda. And then we will probably not let you off the hook on you did mention a few things about funding. So, and some funding ideas. I think most of the UN is facing some serious resource constraints. And those of us who are voluntarily financed have been hit a little bit by the Syrian refugee crisis impact on the European aid budgets, etc. So there's some short-term constraints also. So all in all, I think I speak for all of us when I thank you very much for your time and for your much more than insights, for your ability to stimulate some thinking inside. And we'll continue talking to you. I know that you and I have met several times. We have worked with NESTA for a long time. I actually still think that NESTA's showing up in Bratislava in 2008 was the first time UN and NESTA talked, and it was under my leadership. So it's great to see you again. So with those few words, a round of applause. Thank you.